place where we come to see who we really are, not just somebody else's reflection of who we are.
The Schomburg Center is a place of culture, it's a place of history, it's a place of knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is a repository of all of the things that has documented our sense of worth as a people.
For me, that means that it is a place of immense power.
The Schomburg Center is a public research library and a cultural institution.
For the study of the Pan-African world.
It is perhaps the best in the world.
My Schomburg Center is Arturo Alfonso Schomburg.
Arturo Schomburg said, Black history and culture and intellect exists at a time when most people didn't believe that. He collected those evidences, and that became the beginning of the collection.
And it has expanded and has grown to where it is now a world-class institution.
It holds over 10 million items.
There's no parallel anywhere that brings to light what we as people of color have done, what we continue to do.
Black culture is all of culture. The universals that animate everyone's life happen here for all people.
The Schomburg, for me, is one of the center pillars of Harlem. When I started the journey of finding out about Red Rooster and Harlem, the very first place I went to was the Schomburg.
Researchers from around the world come and use what we have here.
I could not have written just about any of the books that I've written without the Schomburg Center's archives, resources.
The Schomburg Center is much more than a library. We encourage lifelong learning and exploration.
The Junior Scholars Program is a Saturday program with students from 5th grade to senior year in high school to help them learn about Black history and culture.
Learning about my history is important because it teaches me who I am.
The Schomburg Junior Scholars Program is going to do nothing but uplift them.
So many talented and brilliant people have walked the corridors of this amazing institution over the years. From Octavia Butler to Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, Ella Fitzgerald, Alvin Ailey, and Harry Belafonte, who graced the stage in this room of the American Negro Theater.
This place evokes great memories. It was a gift to us in our community to really try to find that space to reflect expressions of Black experience. I just knew that the environment and what I saw these young African Americans doing was a place I needed to be.
What is my Schomburg Center? I'm standing here at the Cosmogram, which underneath holds the ashes of the poet Langston Hughes. On the evening when this Cosmogram was dedicated, people began to empty out of the auditorium. A jazz trio struck up, and to my amazement, Amira Baraka went over and asked Maya Angelou for a dance. And they started to dance on top of the Cosmogram, on top of the ashes of Langston Hughes, and I felt what a fitting way to kiss the memory of Langston.
The Schomburg Center is a research institute and a library, but it's so much more than that.
There's something going on every day.
So many amazing people come here to talk about their creative craft, to share what inspires them. The Schomburg Center's collections help to tell stories even beyond our walls.
The Schomburg Center is here in this exhibition at MoMA, One-Way Ticket, Jacob Lawrence's Migration Series. We depend on the resources of the Schomburg to enable us to tell this story. Thinking about the implications of the past on the present is absolutely crucial for understanding the next steps, understanding what we have to do to go forward.
We today have the responsibility of making sure that new artists and activists, new scholars and poets know that this place continues to be a resource and a source of inspiration for the work that we must continue to do.
The Schomburg Center is knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is education.
The Schomburg Center is home, it is family, it is foundational.
The Schomburg Center is inspiration.
The Schomburg is with me in everything that I do.
Community, inside and out.
The Schomburg Center is us.
The Schomburg Center is you, and we invite each and every one of you to find your Schomburg Center.
evening. It's good to see everyone. Welcome to Conversations in Black Freedom Studies. How many people have been to Conversations in Black Freedom Studies before? Very good, very good. So I am Professor Jean Theo Harris. I teach at Brooklyn College, and along with Professor Kamosi Woodard at Sarah Lawrence, we started this series 5 years ago through the vision, with the vision of Khalil Muhammad, to bring conversation around new works in Black history, and create a public space for that conversation at a moment when bookstores were closing, when there were fewer and fewer public spaces to hear about new work. And one of the things I think that animated us was the idea of history that we need for the present. And certainly tonight's program, and this is the end of our 5th year, so that's very exciting. So we've been here 5 years. I know. And in some ways, tonight's program, I think, epitomizes why we started this, which is sort of history that gives us a way to see the present more clearly. And certainly around the history of police brutality in New York City and the long, long fight to expose it and change it, right? Does not begin, right, with Eric Garner. It does not begin with Amadou Diallo. It does not begin with Eleanor Bumpurs. One of the things that the 4 people who have come tonight to share with us their research will show us is a much, much longer struggle, right, that we now take up in the present. And so we are very, very lucky tonight to have 4 scholars of kind of the history of the fight against police brutality in New York. Now, before I introduce them, Kamosi and I want to thank sort of the person who in many ways is the most responsible for the kind of daily logistics of Conversations in Black Freedom Studies, and that is Aisha Becker-Burroughs. And we would not have this sort of forum if we did not have her vision and her work. So if you would join with me in sort of thanking her for that. She is really kind of who kind of helps us to imagine on a daily way how to keep this space and this conversation alive. Conversations in Black Freedom Studies takes place during the school year. In many ways, it is like a seminar in the city. So tonight's program is our last for the semester or the season, and we will be back in September, but we take the summer off. So that's enough logistics. Certainly, I think we are at a moment in this country where this conversation tonight could not be more urgent. And the books we are discussing, and we will have a signing in the lobby after the program, right, are 3 amazing books, but also 2 books that are in progress. So 2 new books, Michael Flamm's In the Heat of the Summer and Cathy Schneider's Police, Power, and Race Riots. We'll be discussing that. Clarence Taylor will be signing his book, Civil Rights in New York City, but in fact talking about his new book on the history of policing in New York, as will Christopher Hayes. Christopher Hayes is coming to us from Rutgers Newark. Clarence Taylor has just retired from the City University of New York. Cathy Schneider is here from American University in DC, and Michael Flamm has come the farthest. He's here from Ohio Wesleyan in Ohio. So please join me in welcoming Christopher Hayes, Clarence Taylor, Cathy Schneider, and Michael Flamm. Thank you.
Thank you, Professors Woodard and Theo Harris, for having me. Thanks to all of you. I do feel quite fortunate to be here at the Schomburg Center, a place that has given me so much and asked for nothing in return. And so this is my opportunity to give back a little bit. Police brutality in New York City is a topic as old as policing itself. I studied New York City in the mid-20th century, and it's not hard to find examples of excessive force there, whether against high-profile individuals like the Ghanaian ambassador or ordinary New Yorkers, particularly people of color. It's also not hard to find prominent Black New Yorkers decrying police violence. We could look at Jackie Robinson, a moderate Republican, who said he was, quote, familiar with the kind of frenzied and sadistic brutality that many of the New York City police force feel they can get away with in dealing with Negro and Puerto Rican citizens. And there's Adam Clayton Powell, the congressman who declared, the black man is mad, mad with continued police brutality of the white policeman. He's been mad as far as I can remember. Police brutality, when exposed, can get a lot of attention, and for good reason. It's a matter of life and death, dignity and freedom. It's spectacular in the literal sense of the word. It's often public, and it represents the most personal face of the hostile, indifferent state. Excessive force and murder are exactly what the police are not supposed to be doing. And when we look at what touches off the modern urban uprisings that began here coming up on 53 years ago, it's almost always some kind of conflict with the police. Whether Harlem in '64, white officer killing a black boy, LA in '92, 4 white officers get off for extended beating of a black man caught on tape, or Ferguson, 2014, a white officer killing a young black man. But that's not the only problem. It's what drives people out into the streets, but I don't think it's all that has people ready to hit the streets. Whenever there's a rebellion, the public conversation about the causes seems to inevitably shift to what we can do about policing. And then it falls off the map. This was true 50 years ago, and it's true today. This is my point here. While excessive force is undeniably distributed unequally along racial lines, this is but a reflection of American society. Access to quality education is not equal. Employment is not equal. Income is not equal. Wealth is not equal. Neighborhoods and living conditions are not equal. They weren't in 1964, and they're not today. And the people who live these lives know it every day. And the rest of us, we don't have to deal with it if we don't want to. And this everyday quiet violence tends to build a seething resentment in people. And conflict with police is usually the spark to the fuel. But this evening, I'm here to talk more about what the people of Harlem did want from the police. Black New Yorkers in the 50s and the 60s, especially those living in disinvested neighborhoods, which at that time certainly would have been the majority, had 3 principal complaints against the police. 1, a lack of black police. 2, insufficient policing. 3, aggressive, racialized policing. I think these still sound familiar to us. In 1964, New York City had the world's largest municipal police force of over 27,000. It was 5% black in a city that was 16% black. The black officers who did work for the force were often put into high-crime black neighborhoods and considered riot insurance. So if something happened, maybe the people in the neighborhood would look around and say, well, we have black police, and they wouldn't rebel. Repeated surveys of Harlem throughout the mid-60s showed that residents generally wanted more and better policing. Not more of the same, not simply more police, but policing that addressed the concerns of ordinary people. Street crime, like muggings, robberies, selling drugs, using drugs. People in Harlem wanted their neighborhood to be as safe as anyone else's. And they wanted that accomplished through respectful, careful, and professional policing. Residents of New York's black neighborhoods frequently criticized the police department for inadequately patrolling their streets and allowing crime and vice to thrive. They felt the police ignored much of the criminal activity that they encountered, arguing the same police would act quickly upon the same crime if they encountered it in a white neighborhood. But because Harlem was a black neighborhood, they allowed it to go on. In other words, that's just what goes on there, so there's no point in trying to do anything about it. So the more police ignore crime in an area, the more they encourage it, helping white people conclude that criminality and blackness go hand in hand. And while New York's police often seemed to behave as spectators when crime presented itself openly in black neighborhoods, they participated very actively in these same communities in other ways. The morning after the rebellions began here in 1964 in July, the Reverend Richard A. Hildebrand, also president of the Manhattan NAACP, addressed his flock at Bethel AME on West 132nd, three blocks down from here. He said, "I'm sure we're as anxious as the police commissioner to stop violence. But in order to maintain peace, the commissioner must do something to restore confidence in the police department. Whether it is true or not, we read in the papers about policemen who get rich off the crime and violence that goes on in our community, and it does appear that they are overzealous when it comes to brutality against Negroes. So who has respect for the police?" Other people had similar experiences. In East Harlem, Gilberto, Aranea, Valentin, head of a local Puerto Rican rights group, said, "The police do not protect us. They try to keep us in line. They run the West Side like a plantation." The NYPD responded to this kind of criticism with sensitivity training. They flooded schools with a Spanish language pamphlet called "Your Friend the Policeman." And they committed to recruiting more Puerto Rican officers so that they would have more than 200 out of 27,000. A white officer who patrolled Puerto Rican neighborhoods offered his opinions. "We treat them the same as anybody. I don't know why they're complaining, except maybe they are sensitive. You know, a little on the temperamental, hot-blooded side." Another issue is that there was quite a bit going obviously wrong in the city, particularly for people of color, and no one seemed to be able to find the resources or authority to do much about it. There are a lot of topics I could use to illustrate this point, but I'm gonna use housing, because it's so important and it's so overlooked in its role in creating stable foundation for personal growth and advancement. So in the mid-1950s, the residents of a group of tenements designated for demolition as part of urban renewal filed hundreds of valid complaints with various city agencies. They reflected living conditions such as falling ceilings, faulty wiring, leaky plumbing, rat infestations, unsafe gas conditions, and so on. Scores of tenants were using kerosene heaters to keep warm because their buildings didn't have heat. A 70-year-old woman died in a fire related to her heater. Still, the city's Bureau of Real Estate, in charge of supervising maintenance at urban renewal projects, refused to issue summonses. The health department was not even sending inspectors to investigate because the agency, as a spokesman explained, could not send one man into those buildings alone because he may run across a vicious dog or derelict sleeping in hallways or badly lighted halls where he may meet all types of characters. And we can't send two inspectors in together because we're too short-staffed. Even if the health department could find the manpower, he said, "Our inspectors have been told not to issue summonses there because the city is involved with building it." A few years later, the developer finally began construction, and after a few name changes, the project became Lenox Terrace. Anybody know where that is? It's, walk outside, look right. It's right there. And so this is how urban renewal went down in New York for a long time, and I can talk about that later. So maybe you're wondering where I'm talking about housing. I'll tell you. What does this have to do with policing? The widespread abuse of low-income tenants was criminal in nature. It's a fact. But it went largely unpunished. And no police officer was going to come and arrest your landlord for putting you and your family in danger. You had very little recourse. Discrimination kept people trapped. And housing is one of the key components that keeps people down. You live in a disinvested neighborhood, your local schools probably won't be very good. Even if you finish high school, your shot at going to a decent college or getting a solid job with opportunities for advancement is greatly diminished, which will keep you in that neighborhood or one like it, and so the cycle repeats. About a decade later, rent strikers in Harlem issued the following leaflet: "The police department in Harlem is here to protect the slumlords, not the tenants. These facts clearly show why. 1, when the slumlords are guilty of no heat, no hot water, and the rats biting our children, the police department does nothing. 2, when tenants are being robbed or when apartments are broken into, where are the police? Somewhere drunk? In some woman's apartment? In a garage asleep? Collecting graft and payoffs from prostitutes? Payoffs from numbermen or dope peddlers? But when it's time to illegally evict a tenant for a slumlord, the whole police department acts with great speed. When the Knapp Commission on Police Corruption in the City issued its report in 1972, it found the majority of NYPD officers were involved in low-level corruption, like taking money from sex workers, people in the numbers game, and drug dealers in exchange for not arresting them, just like the rent strikers and Reverend Hildebrand had claimed, though I'm sure a lot of people outside of Harlem wouldn't have believed it at the time. And a lot of this stuff is still relevant today. These issues that are not behind us. Some things are better, some things are worse. That policing is still in dire need of reform is self-evident. We're reminded of this in the crudest of ways quite often. The struggle continues. We need to keep these other struggles in mind, though, as all these things are related and feed into one another. I fear that a society without at least some police who use violence and deadly force is a utopian fantasy. We can work to minimize that, and we have to, but we also have to address why so many people in so many places are so angry and desperate. In the aftermath of some episode of rebellion, I feel like the conversation invariably goes to a specific measure to reform policing. Today it's body cameras. Back then it was civilian review boards. And I get it, but such steps on their own, they're not going to make people's rage and despair go away. And trying to keep a lid on things is a terrible strategy. I have to conclude that it won't be long before we experience another uprising in an American city, and it won't be just because of the police. They'll just be the immediate cause. And if I may say one last thing, history is not just about the past. What drives my work is that history is about understanding the present and can also be a way forward. Without understanding what came before, what happened, how we got here, what we tried, what worked, what didn't, we'll keep toiling away in a perpetual year zero. Thank you.
I'm going to first start off by thanking both Gene and Kamosi for inviting me here. But I also want to thank them for over the years of being such terrific scholars, turning out such terrific work that has influenced my work and other scholars. And let me just note here, and I don't mean to embarrass anyone, I've never met two people who have been more generous to young scholars, and actually older scholars like myself, in terms of sharing, knowledge, new information, working with folks to get their work done. So, my hat's off to you. Now, I'm going to confess that, I have a confession, that I really didn't want to do the book that I'm just completing on police brutality in New York City. And one of the reasons I didn't want to do it, because I knew when I was going to go and look at these cases, I was going to get angry. I'm old enough to remember many of these cases. Randolph Evans, who 15 years old in 1970s, in Brooklyn, who just went over to an officer in the Brooklyn housing project, asking him, was he going to a certain house, and the cop turned around and said, "You're damn right," turned around and shot him and killed him point blank. The cop never denied that, this was essentially self-defense. He made the argument that he had a rare epileptic fit. He never had it before, He never had it afterwards, and he was acquitted. And so cases like that, going back and seeing that, and just throughout the years, and saying, well, going through this is going to clearly make me angry, and also my own experience with police officers that were brutalized but constantly harassed. My son and my nephews. My nephew who was a student at John Jay College, School of Criminal Justice, going home one day, and officers just took him and threw him up against a car. No reason, just to search him and let him go. So, my son coming back with his buddies from a football game, being stopped by a police officer, calling them boy, and they just had to sit there and endure this humiliation. So, it's incident after incident. So, but I got the call, and some of you who in the religious community know what I mean by that. I was at an event. They were talking about policing, and I heard a lot of nonsense, and I said, okay, you know what? Maybe I should start, working on this book on policing. But what gave me, I'll say, balance, was coming across this not just long a battle of police brutality, but also this long battle of resistance. And that's something that, some folks have written on, but, I don't think there's been enough said about this long history of resistance challenging police power throughout the country, and my focus is here in New York City. And the power is enormous. Police power is immense. And so, activists were fully aware of this. But, this is what they were taking on. Let's face it, the police are backed by, the courts, by law, by those in power, politicians. And of course, they are glorified constantly. Right? Just turn on your television. Right? Watch television shows about police officers. Over and over again we get this. And at the same time, black folks have been criminalized and demonized. And so, it's one of the hardest issues to confront, because for a long time, many folks denied that there was police brutality. They denied its existence, and I'm talking about criminologists. Of course, those in law enforcement, the media, and others. But so this is what activists had to confront. And so my work sort of looks at the role that activists played in challenging police power. And at the very basic argument is that in order to challenge police power, we have to sort of reduce that police power. In order for us to do that, we have to increase the power of ordinary people and citizens. And so, I'd start, this book looks at groups like the American Communist Party. In particular, I look at two African Americans, Benjamin Davis, who was a councilman in Harlem back in the late 1930s and 1940s, and another African American communist by the name of William Paterson, who was head of the National Civil Rights Congress. And they helped conceptualize police brutality in this city and throughout the nation. It's Davis who pushes this notion that police brutality is northern lynching. He puts out a pamphlet in his office, and he attempts to make the case. It is William Paterson who said it's part of a program of genocide against black people. And he puts out in 1951 a magnificent petition to send to the UN accusing the United States of genocide. And he documents case after case of police murders. And so the book sort of pays attention to that. It also pays attention to the black press. In particular, a Harlem publication that was short-lived, but extremely important, and that is the People's Voice. Christopher mentioned, the Reverend Adam Clayton Powell. It is Powell who is the one who puts out this newspaper. And from 1942 to 1946, it is the leading voice against police brutality in New York City, in particular, in Harlem. Not only does it, we have cell phones and, we have cameras. Well, 1930s, 1940s, that wasn't the case, but it was the black press that went out and documented these cases of police brutality. And the People's Voice went even further than just going out and reporting and keeping it in the news. They always criticize the explanation that the cops gave for brutalizing and killing people. And they always took the side of those victims. So it was a monumental paper, unfortunately short-lived, but it was nevertheless a paper that put this issue in the forefront. Someone, I think, others are going to talk about conventional civil rights organizations, CORE in New York City played a role, but the Nation of Islam. We know the role that the Nation of Islam played in challenging the police, but I think there is an oversimplification of the picture that has been drawn. The Nation of Islam did confront police physically, but it didn't just do that. I mean, they had a larger strategy. It was multifaceted, including a legal strategy that usually doesn't get talked about. This case here, we see Malcolm X. This is in 1957, and it is the Johnson X Hinton case. This is Johnson Hinton, a man who was beaten badly by the police. He was beaten so badly, they had to put a metal plate in his head. And you've probably seen the Spike Lee movie, Malcolm X. He notes this episode, and Spike goes overboard a little. I mean, exaggerates it. And he shows a sort of confrontational approach of Malcolm X. But what we don't see is, what was going on behind the scenes of Malcolm sitting down, discussing, talking with the police officers, and essentially using this legal strategy, and it's Johnson Hinton who won the largest lawsuit to date, by 1959, close to $100,000. And so, the strategy was that we will essentially make this expensive for the city if they want to carry this out. And that's a strategy that the NAACP and others use. Let me because I only have 5 minutes, let me get to the crux of this book, and I'll start by just looking at 1966, because one of the important moments in the story of challenging police brutality came in 1966 when a Republican mayor by the name of John Lindsay backed a sort of moderate civilian complaint review board. Now, this had been a call by black activists for a long time. But in '66, Lindsay was running for mayor, clearly wanted black support, and he came out and he proposed a review board that consisted of 3 police officers, 4 civilians. That was too much for the police, and this is the moment where the police become extremely political, and they ran a racist campaign against this review board, and they managed to, with the support of the newly formed Conservative Party and William F. Buckley Jr., managed to get a referendum on the ballot in '66, and it was defeated overwhelmingly, and it was across racial lines. Now, I said this is a pivotal moment because this is the moment where police not only managed to hold on to their overwhelming power over citizens, but they gained political power. And they won that referendum because they used a false narrative. And that's the narrative of essentially, if you allow this civilian complaint review board to go through, you're going to essentially allow black criminals to run wild. And they've been using that playbook ever since. So it's a long struggle, and hopefully during the Q&A I'll have time to, maybe we can talk about solutions, how we should really, because we can't talk about police reform. I think we got to throw that. Let me just say that right away. Throw that out the window. Now, we need something much more radical. Okay, thank you.
Thank you all for coming. It is an incredible privilege to be here at the Schomburg Center, and I want to echo what Clarence said. I am deeply grateful to the organizers, the generous organizers of this series, for inviting me. My new book is the first full-scale account of an extraordinarily important week in the history of New York City and this country. And so what I'd like to do tonight, very briefly, is take you back to that week, July 1964, and talk a little bit about what happened. On the morning of July 16, 1964, an off-duty white police officer by the name of Thomas Gilligan shot and killed a black teenager by the name of James Powell. The shooting took place in front of Robert Wagner Junior High School on East 76th Street. Controversy immediately swirled around this event. Was James Powell armed with a knife? Some witnesses said yes, others said no. Had Lieutenant Gilligan identified himself as a police officer before he fired 3 bullets into James Powell? Did the police officer have alternatives to the use of deadly force? Did the police officer execute James Powell while he was lying on the sidewalk bleeding to death? Again, some witnesses say yes, some witnesses say no. That same evening, Thursday, July 16th, 1964, Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater accepts the Republican nomination for president. And in his acceptance speech that night, he injects into presidential politics the incendiary issue of law and order. Goldwater tells the Republican delegates, as well as the American people watching on television, that the country faces a rising threat from crime in the streets, from the mob, and from the jungle. The next day, Friday, July 17th, demonstrations begin in New York City. The demonstrators have 2 core demands. The first is that they want Lieutenant Gilligan either suspended or fired from the force. The second thing they want is the creation of a true civilian review board, with a majority of civilians on the board. On Saturday evening, July 16th, planned peaceful demonstrations begin in Harlem. But as the evening wears on, those demonstrations evolve into clashes with police officers, confrontations with police officers. It begins outside the 28th precinct, and then it spreads through central Harlem. In an effort to suppress the barrage of bottles and bricks that begin to fly down on the officers from the buildings in central Harlem, the NYPD does something unprecedented in its history. It begins to fire warning or suppressing shots. We have no idea who gave the order. We have no idea how many shots were fired that night. It was in the thousands. Miraculously, somehow, only one person was killed that night. But although the NYPD will never apologize for its actions, it will also never again resort to that kind of force. It's almost an implicit acknowledgement about how extraordinarily dangerous and unprecedented that particular tactic was. Now, while the NYPD is firing suppression shots, thousands of them, black activists are working tirelessly to try to restore peace to the streets of Harlem. James Farmer of CORE is out there night after night trying to organize the protesters, the demonstrators, into constructive, peaceful action. So too is Bayard Rustin, Dr. King's right-hand man. He too is walking the streets night after night. There are also black officers in the NYPD who are doing their best to restore calm. Captain Lloyd Seeley of the New York Police Department, one of the 3 highest-ranking black officers in the NYPD at the time, is there night after night. Seeley will eventually become the first black commander here in Harlem at the 28th Precinct, a very important step forward. But neither the commissioner nor the mayor are willing to yield on the 2 issues that the demonstrators want action on most. The commissioner, Michael Murphy, refuses to suspend or dismiss Gilligan while the grand jury is still looking at the case. Mayor Wagner will not implement by executive authority, by executive action, a civilian review board. As Clarence mentioned, that's something that John Lindsay will do later after he's elected mayor in 1965. Wagner will bring to New York City Dr. Martin Luther King in an effort to calm the waters. King has limited success, and in fact, this is a very critical moment in the black freedom struggle because King now realizes just how complicated the issues are here in the North. He had a sense before, but now he's confronted face to face with just how intractable the situation is here. In a sense, what happens in New York City in 1964 for Dr. King is a preview of what he will encounter in Chicago in 1966, when he battles against Mayor Daley there as well in housing segregation. Now, meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., and this is part of the story that I focused on in my book, Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson, is following these developments extraordinarily closely. And I know just how closely because you can listen to Johnson work the telephone day after day, trying to find a solution for what's happening. Johnson has 2 major concerns. One, of course, is his political future. He's very concerned that Goldwater and the Republicans are going to exploit this situation, take political advantage of it, and he is determined to find a way to calm the situation so white voters won't become overly anxious and they will stick to his program and what he's offering. The second concern is about the fate, the future of the Civil Rights Act. And here I need to remind you, Lyndon Johnson signed into law that Civil Rights Act on July 2nd. That's 2 weeks before Gilligan shoots Powell. It's not a done deal. It's not a foreseen, it's very unclear whether the government will be able to implement and enforce the Civil Rights Act. Will white Americans accept it? Johnson and his allies are very concerned that the fate of the Civil Rights Act itself is now at stake on the streets of New York City, in Harlem and in Brooklyn. This disorder is going to extend for 6 nights, the first 3 nights in Harlem, the next 3 nights in Bed-Stuy and Brooklyn. So it's not just here in Harlem as well that this story is taking place. Now, in the aftermath of this unrest in Harlem and Brooklyn, you can see etched into this photograph the uncertainty, the fear, the mistrust that white merchants and black merchants feel. You can also see some of the consequences as the police begin to catalog just how much damage has been done to white businesses and black businesses by looters, by arsonists. And of course, many businesses will never reopen. And this is part of the story of Harlem and the economics of Harlem and Brooklyn in the aftermath of 1964. Many black businesses in particular were not able to get insurance. Couldn't afford it, couldn't get it from insurance companies. So when they were destroyed in 1964, their owners had no way to rebuild, no way to start again. They had to leave. About 25% of businesses, it's estimated, in the core commercial sections of Bed-Stuy and Harlem are shuttered, literally shuttered after what happens in July 1964. And many of these businesses won't return for many, many years. Now, in the fall of 1964, Lyndon Johnson takes 2 very important, very fateful steps. First, Johnson decides that he has to attack what he and other liberals, white and black, see as the root causes of what has happened in New York, and that is poverty, failing schools, poor housing, as Christopher mentioned, sort of all of these social conditions, unemployment caused by automation and discrimination. So a war on poverty is going to address, from the liberal perspective, these root causes that have caused this explosion in 1964. At the same time, Johnson realizes he needs to protect his right flank from the conservative threat, and so he promises that if elected in 1965, he's going to launch a war on crime and commit the resources of the federal government to this effort. Well, what happens to that war on crime, and I won't go into it tonight, you can ask me in the Q&A, it's a long and convoluted story, is that gradually that war on crime evolves and is hijacked, and it becomes the war on drugs. That war on crime that Lyndon Johnson promises to launch in the aftermath of the unrest here in New York City, in Harlem and Brooklyn in 1964, that war on crime sets sort of the political and institutional stage for the war on drugs to come. And I'm reasonably confident that everybody in this room knows the consequences of that war on drugs and what it's done in terms of mass incarceration and all sorts of other problems and costs that we face. Now, I want to just tell you a little bit about this book, which I just completed. One of the great privileges, one of the great opportunities that I had doing this book was to conduct a series of oral histories with people who had never spoken about these events in the summer of 1964. So I interviewed journalists, black and white. I interviewed police officers, black and white. I interviewed activists and participants and bystanders. I essentially talked to everybody I could. And I learned a great deal. 2 interviews stand out in my mind. The first is an interview that I did with Percy Sutton. And I think many of you in this room probably remember the businessman, Malcolm X's lawyer, radio station owner, politician, very important member of the community here. And I interviewed him at the Apollo Theater in his office over there. And I asked him about police brutality. And I asked him about how the events affected him. And he looked at me, and it was the one time in the entire interview where he became openly emotional, and I could see sort of tears welling in his eyes. And he said, "You've got to understand, it's not the brutality, it's the daily indignities and discourtesies. It's the casual harassment." And he went on to talk about, and I could see, I mean, this was an extraordinarily accomplished and successful man who probably wore a beautiful suit every single day of the week. And when he described to me what he had undergone, it sort of made me realize that, in a sense, police brutality, these flashpoints, sometimes disguise the day-to-day reality that really sets the stage and leads to these explosions that others have sort of talked about. And the other interview, and I'll finish here, is it wasn't really even an interview that I could do, not the way I wanted. I tracked down the officer, Lieutenant Gilligan, whose shooting triggered all of this. And I guess I behaved a little bit like a stalker. I sent him letters, I made phone calls, I went to his house and knocked on the door, wouldn't speak to me, wouldn't talk to me. I interviewed many police officers, so I had them try to convince him to talk to me. But I finally got him on the phone once, and I explained to him, I said, "I just want to give you a chance to tell your side of the story. I have no axe to grind, I've got no agenda, just, tell me what you believe happened, what you did." And he said, "That chapter in my life is closed. I don't ever want to go into it again." And then he said to me, "Look at all the facts and tell the truth." Well, in this book, that's what I've tried to do, and I hope I've succeeded. Thank you very much.
I also want to thank the organizers, and I'm very pleased to be here. My book compares the '64 riot and the riots that occurred in France, and so I am going to start with France today. October 27th, 2005, 3 young boys, teenagers between the ages of 15 and 17, Bouna, Muhitin, and Ziad, were returning from a soccer game and decided to avoid an identity check in their neighborhood, Clichy-sous-Bois. The police set off after them and cornered them in front of this electric grid. The boys looked at the police officers who had stun guns drawn, and they looked at the warning signs on the grid, and they scaled an 8-foot wall, climbed over the barbed wire, and hid in the grid. Meanwhile, the police commander called headquarters and said, "We have them cornered in a grid. We want to make sure they don't get out. Please send reinforcements." And then he said, "Wait, they're in an electric grid. Their skin isn't worth anything anymore. Cancel the reinforcements." And the police abandoned the kids. Predictably, the kids in the dark, looking for a way out, one of them hit the generator. Ziad and Bouna, who I showed you earlier, were immediately killed. Bouna was 15, a straight-A student. Ziad was a local soccer champion, 17 years old. For 3 consecutive weeks in November, flames consumed 280 towns and suburbs throughout France. Youths burnt 10,000 cars, 500 schools and other public buildings. There were over 5,000 arrests. Only 120 of the youths arrested had been born outside France. As organizers told me, boys had done nothing. They were good kids, done well in school, everyone knew them, everybody loved them. They were the kinds of kids who would always do things for others. And the witnesses heard the police on the phone joking and talking about their skin not being worth anything anymore. And then after the Minister of Interior in charge of police, Nicolas Sarkozy, defended the police officers not once but twice. The first time, he accused the kids of being criminals. Why else would they hide an electric grid? And the second time, days later, when police shot a tear gas canister into a mosque, asphyxiating hundreds of women and children. Again, Sarkozy defended the police officers. Organizers told me the pain we felt was now mixed with outrage. We could no longer restrain the kids in the streets. We were shaking. It was like they were externalizing their internal explosions. Some kids in pain cut themselves. These kids, instead of cutting themselves, set things on fire. It was like getting rid of all this pain inside and throwing it outside. So my book asks, why did police interact with distinct minorities in such dramatically different settings in such similar ways, engaging in racial profiling, harassment, and violence? Why did deadly confrontations between police and inhabitants of disadvantaged minority neighborhoods lead to riots in New York in 1964, and then across the United States in the 60s, in France, French suburbs in 2005, and then across the country? And we could ask again in Ferguson and Baltimore more recently. And finally, why doesn't New York burn anymore? And specifically, I asked, why didn't it burn in the 90s? I argue, my seems to have disappeared in here, that racially targeted police violence, particularly the killings of unarmed minority youth, sparks moral outrage, activates racial boundaries, crystallizes grievances along a single us-them boundary, and provokes riots. No feature of a racially divided society is a more potent symbol of racial domination or instills the message of subjugation more forcefully than police. The main characteristics of a riot-prone city is one where political authorities are impervious and far more often acutely hostile to minority community demands, where grievances cannot be addressed through existing institutional channels. Riots, at the end, are the last resort. They occur only for communities that find all other paths to justice blocked. As the French police organization, Urgent, Our Police Kills, t-shirt shows, on the front it says, Urgent, Our Police Kill, and on the back it says, but what does the state do? So I argue, I'm glad to have other people talk about John Lindsay. So I actually argue changes in New York, and I trace it back to John Lindsay. John Lindsay was the vice chair of the Kerner Commission, and he argued that riots occur where the relationship between police and residents has grown so toxic as to render the neighborhoods combustible. So he pursued several areas of reform. One of them the other panelists have mentioned, civilian review boards. He drastically constrained and curtailed the conditions under which police could use lethal violence, saying to Mayor Daley, his police did not kill children. He also instituted community policing. A lot of these reforms were short-lived. But one of the reforms that had a long-lasting impact on the city was he wanted to give youth in hot neighborhoods a sense of ownership in government. And so he hired neighborhood youth as peacekeepers, as communication liaisons, as participants in task forces to keep the city abreast of issues before they became explosive. And these youth who had cut their teeth on the Great Race riots honed their organizing skills doing this. And they went on to create radical power organizations, Puerto Rican Power, Black Power, organizations like the Young Lords. And those organizations, in turn, gave birth to an array of community-based groups dedicated to fighting police brutality. Panama Alba is a case. He was a young lord. In the 90s, he was the director of the Coalition Against Police Brutality. Richie Perez was a young lord who created the Justice Committee, plays a very important role now, and I will get to them later. Panama Alba says that police kill with impunity because there's a culture that promotes the idea that these abuses are the price that one must pay for security, for having police fight crime. But the police act like an occupational army in our community. Typical was the poster they put up after 9/11. On one side was a soldier. On the other side was a New York City policeman. It read, "Support your troops abroad and at home." But he says in a war, the population is an enemy. Here, we are citizens. So I interviewed a number of parents whose kids were killed by police, particularly in the 90s, but also in the first decade of the 21st century. Iris Bias is the mother of Anthony Bias, who was choked to death by Officer Francis Labate in 1994. Anthony had come home to visit his mother. He was actually waiting his results of the police academy in Florida. He was playing football with his friends in the street, his brothers, during the Christmas holidays. And his football hit Labate's car. Labate was supposed to be off the streets. He had already had 12 violence complaints against him. But as the brothers watched and begged for Anthony's life, he choked Anthony to death, crushed his windpipe. His mother says the night Anthony died, everyone was kicking and punching walls. We started marching from here to the precinct. I wanted to tell them there was a murderer inside. I had never been part of a movement, but Labate made me part of a movement by murdering my son. Oh, jeez, really already? Oh my God. Okay, let me rush through. Alba says there was an extraordinary mobilization to get the DA to indict, another extraordinary level to get the federal government to step in. The effort to do justice in a single case, he says, is enormous, just to get district attorneys to issue indictments, to get the Justice Department to file civil rights charges, to help people through civil suits. People burn out, they get frustrated, it's difficult to go on and on. All of the parents I know who were mobilized thought that their child's case would be the last. But the justice movement began to feel frustrated. They thought, we are putting all of this energy into single cases. We are not resolving the overall problem. We are leaving the parents desolate, and still the cases go on. Aileen's case, I cry in my sleep when I go to therapy and talk. Maybe I won't cry. I thought it would get better, but it gets worse. I'm a quiet person. I keep all this stuff inside. I'm going to rush through her case and just jump to Eric Garner's case. So when Eric Garner's killing happened, the Justice Committee decided that they had to take a new strategy. And Eric Garner's mother, Gwen, was part of that new strategy. Gwen says, like the other mothers, you take our sons, you rip out our hearts. After the death of my son, I felt it was my duty to speak out, to really organize. And his stepfather told me he was out in the streets after Eric died, but he was picking up garbage. He was telling kids, don't throw garbage in the street. We don't want you to play the fool. We aren't about that. These shops aren't our enemy. These police are not our enemy. We only want justice. We want the officers who killed Eric to face justice. So Yul-San Yim, who at least at the time of Eric Garner's death, was the head of the Justice Committee. I think she's head of Communities United for Police Reform, a coalition of 60 organizations right now. And she and Eric Garner's mother, and Anthony Bias's mother, and Anthony Rosario's mother, they all went to Albany together. We went to Albany together. We put a makeshift coffin in front of the governor's office. We did everything we could to get his attention. We got together with the other mothers. We shared and worked together, so we are not alone. The governor promised to sign an executive order for us if the bill was not passed, creating an independent prosecutor to investigate police violence. And I'll go. Gwen Carr said, if people come together and strategize, they can make changes. An individual alone cannot do anything. In the end, she says, we got pretty much what we wanted, the ladies at the forefront. We banded together. Now we have an inspector general in the city. Now we have a special prosecutor in New York State for every case in New York State where a police officer kills someone unarmed. Hopefully, that will mean this will not happen to other parents. And while every parent told me that, I think in this case, it has had a significant impact. July 8th, Attorney General Eric Schneiderman was designated special prosecutor. Up until the time he was designated, New York was killing approximately 10 unarmed people a year. That's in the state. He was appointed in July. 7 people had been killed before July. In 2015, the rest of the year, 2 were killed. 2016, 4 were killed. And so far, none have been killed in 2017. That is, the argument was made that what we need to do is hold police officers accountable. District attorneys are too close to the police, and they are unlikely to prosecute. That if police know they are going to be held accountable by an independent authority, they will be less likely to use lethal violence. And that seems to have been helping a great deal.
I think there are 2 mics. Yeah, 2 mics. Is the police line up? No, I mean, please line up. Sorry about that. You might assume the position if I say it like that.
Yes, I'd love to talk more about, I don't know what other term you want to call it, but I would use the radical reform of the police, not just the reform of the police. Because we're always going to have police, so the question is, how do we reconstitute them? Part of that is the question of systematically transforming police culture. Because we've heard about the chokehold 20 years later, 20 years after it was banned, it was used to kill Eric Garner. And yet that wasn't even criminal negligence, which, I mean, as a person who's, I know I'm not schooled in law, but I mean, if you do something you're not supposed to do and you kill somebody, that's negligence. So that chokehold gets passed down by police culture. Whatever reforms in the police academy that go on get neutralized because the cadets come out and the veterans say, don't do that. That'll get you killed. Do it this way. So the question is, how do we systematically disrupt that police culture that's fundamentally dehumanizing, especially people of color? And by the way, mentally ill people are actually the most at danger of being brutalized and killed by the police.
Any comments from?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, now you first, go ahead.
So the chokehold is officially banned in the police, but it's not illegal. It was one of the big demands that Eric Garner's parents and the Justice Committee made of the mayor, who actually vetoed a city council ordinance that would have made it illegal. So it is still illegal. It is still legal. And so that also answers the other question about police. Police actually have to respond to some extent to the political authorities. The problem is what kinds of rules do the political authorities put on the police? What do they punish them for? What do they reward them for?
Well, they're actually afraid to put pressure on the police.
That's true too.
Just as I noted, by '66, the enormous, not just police power, but the political power that police got. I mean, think of this mayor who came in calling for police reform, right? And he didn't want to hire 1,300 more cops. And look what the PBA did to him. And he did an about face. And every time I hear him, he comes on Friday on the Brian Lair show from 10 to 10:30, and every time there's a question about police, he defends the police. He doesn't talk about having police live in the city. He says, well, that's going to happen naturally. They talk about the cameras. Well, they decide when to turn on the cameras and review the tape. And he says that's okay. Because he got his butt kicked by the police. Because they had enormous power.
But it was, sorry.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
It was before he got his butt kicked. He brought in Bratton. All of these parents whose kids had been killed under Bratton, they mobilized to get him elected because he was going to be reformed.
Yeah.
And then he brings in Bratton.
Well, yes, but he was also advocating those police reforms, and he did it about face. So, we have to talk about reducing the power of the police. This is, I think, crucial. You can't just talk about reform. First of all, let's talk about getting rid of that 48-hour rule. It's absolute nonsense. And it was extraordinary when I looked at the Amadou Diallo case. And here are these guys who essentially killed this man. They control the crime scene. And then they don't have to speak to anyone for 48 hours. So they get their story straight, So, this is the type of thing that we sort of have to challenge. And I think, you got to find ways of prosecuting these folks as soon as something happens like this. Locking them up. Two, I think you're going to have to increase the power of ordinary citizens of the police. Why can't people be involved in evaluating how police operate in their communities? Teachers are evaluated, constantly. So, why can't cops be evaluated? We can set up a system where you can do that.
I have an answer for that.
Go ahead.
I may get in trouble for this because I'm employed by the Department of Labor Studies and Employment Relations. But police unions are too powerful.
Well, yes, I agree with you. Right? They will go against this.
Very difficult to get fired for anything. The top of my head, I'm thinking of watching a video of a police officer in Florida literally run someone over. He was not fired. It's on his dash cam, like he recorded it, and he was not fired. The guy who went buck wild on those teenagers in Texas at that pool party a year or two ago, I think that was his third job. And not because he was moving up, because he was moving laterally, because he got in trouble, I think, in Oklahoma, and he's allowed to resign. He got in trouble at his next job, he resigned. And then he got Dallas or wherever it was, he got that job. And the way that their collective bargaining agreements are structured, you are generally allowed to resign unless you've done something egregious that is brought to the public's attention, like this officer in Texas the other day who got fired. I'm not sure for what, whether it was the shooting or the lying, or both. But their unions and their bargaining agreements are so strong, virtually no politicians will stand up to them, because then you're seen as being unsupportive of the police and soft on crime. And that is a basic metric that you have to pass to really hold any kind of elected office. You have to be, it's just an article of faith, you have to be pro-police. And if you challenge their unions, say, well, we'll just go on strike, and then you won't have any police.
But that is also why the families all went to Albany, and why they have the Attorney General of the state now, a special prosecutor for every case in New York where police kill someone unarmed. In April 2016, a district attorney in Troy, New York, issued a non-indictment for a police officer who killed someone unarmed, and the Attorney General sued him. There's only been, since April 2016, 2 unarmed people killed in police. We also, the communities got a new DA elected in the Bronx, a new DA elected in the Brooklyn. So we got Peter Liang was convicted of manslaughter. The officer who killed Marley Graham was forced to resign from the police. And so we're actually seeing, I think that the communities have been really organized and strategic and looking at which actors play key roles. District attorneys are really important. Get district attorneys that are not tough on crime, but are defend the community. Get them elected. Nobody votes in district attorney races. You can do that, right? And attorney generals don't have a direct relationship with the police. Police can't do anything against the attorney general. Police respond to local politics. They respond to the mayor, they respond to the district attorney, but the attorney general of the state, he can act against the police, and that's why they got the governor to appoint a special prosecutor. I think that these groups are incredibly thoughtful, and they should be. They've been working on it for decades.
There's a new book called The Newark Frontier, and it documents that the police community relations training, the police rejected that. They got rid of the guy who was in charge of the police, right? So I think sometimes when we look at the first measure that we're teaching them this, look at what happened with that. And now we have scholars who are looking at that in some detail, and the police openly, matter of fact, they said, we want this guy fired, coming telling us how to handle, people in the community and stuff like that. So so that's the other layer we've got to look at, to what extent this, and Mary Berry, when she was presenting here, went over all the commissions we've done, and it's basically the same set of recommendations at each crisis that are not implemented. So this is important to finally get this, but it's very difficult. We need the movement, because here you have families who are grieving, and they are the ones that we leave to have to carry the ball while they're grieving. I took a mother in Newark to an attorney who had won a $6 million case with a white kid in the suburbs. Police officer killed him. And he heard the mother's case, and then he took me in the back room. He said, look, I'm not going to take this case. I said, no, you're the man. You know, $6 million, you could win this case. He said, no, you don't understand the way the law is written. That white kid's life was worth $6 million. He went to college. We could do a table of what his projected earnings are. He said, your kid is in a job training program. His life is not worth the bullet. And he gave me the job of telling the mother. And I told him that the mother he just said he couldn't help us. I couldn't tell her. But I think we need to do something about it. If we have laws on the book, it's impunity, right? So as long as we are valuing life based on class, right? They know that you can't, you have to, like you said with the case with Malcolm X, right? They have to know they're going to have to pay, that there's going to be hell to pay, right? And as long as there's no consequences, they could act as if they're scared, but they know.
So New York City was actually in the 90s paying $25 million a year to settle cases. After 2000, it went up to $100 million a year. So they settle these cases all the time. Most of the parents I talked to did win millions of dollars in settlements. You know what they did with the money? They created other organizations to fight police brutality. They didn't want blood money. They wanted justice. But who paid? This city paid. Did the police pay? No, there was no accountability by the police. The city can make those payouts and then just, use tax money to make it. And that's right. So that's why they shifted strategy, the organizations. They said, we can't spend all our time trying to get these civil settlements, and the police keep killing more people. We have to figure out a way to hold police accountable. And that's why they came up with this idea, let's get the governor involved, let's get the attorney general, let's have a special prosecutor that has power over district attorneys, that can sue district attorneys, that is independent.
Now, the cop strategy in the early 20th century was to take it to the state level. The reason the police have all these extraordinary powers is they went straight to the state. Matter of fact, we lost many of our liberties. They have the right to, most of us don't even think about that, but this whole thing about the interrogation they do to force you to testify against yourself, part of the American Revolution was that, right? You don't have to testify against yourself, right? So we've lost that. We don't even think about that. You watch the cops on TV harassing people and making them confess against them. So that's supposed to be against your basic liberties, right? Chris, you had it.
I would just like to counter that while these reforms are important, it's too late. Like, by the time that you need the Attorney General to prosecute someone a cop for murdering someone, it's too late. And I think that the original question was how do we not get there in the first place? And I don't have like an answer, and as I said in my talk, I don't believe that it's possible to live in a world in which we have a police department and we have zero excessive uses of excessive force and zero unjust killings. But again, going back to the collective bargaining point, in most other lines of work, like I'm a professor and I have a lot of protections. I'm a public employee, but if I did something illegal, I wouldn't be entitled to, they wouldn't say, well, you beat up one of your students, but that's okay. I would be fired, and I should. So, I mean, that's just a basic thing that you need to be afraid of losing your job, and like you need to be afraid that they're gonna come after you for the $25 million but you don't have, because everyone else in the community that you police, and in New York City, you probably don't even live in the city, if you're an officer here. You're not footing a penny of it.
However, that was the whole idea, and actually police violence dropped dramatically since the Attorney General became special prosecutor, because police officers now know that they're not going to have their friend that's the DA that's going to get them off. If they kill someone now, they're facing the Attorney General. Now they have to hesitate, because and police officers, including reformists, including minority police officers, will all say the same thing. This is a job. If you're held accountable for your actions, those are the actions you worry about. If you are rewarded for certain actions, those are what you do a lot of. What we have is police departments rewarded for the numbers of arrests they do, the number of people they sweep up in the streets, and they're not punished for violence. And so what the parents and these organizations like Justice Committee and Communities United for Police Reform decided to do is let's do something so that police officers know that they will be held accountable. The fact that the AG sued a district attorney for issuing a non-indictment means that the message went out. There has been only 2 police killings of unarmed people since that time. That is 2 years? It's quite an astonishing reduction, because I've been working on this issue since the 90s. There's at least 10 unarmed people killed a year. This is in New York State. There's been, there was 4 in 2016. There's none in 2017. That's a pretty big reduction.
I would like to, 10, 20 years out, look back and see what the numbers have been.
Yeah, and I would also, this is significant, no doubt about that, but we also have to look at the other forms of brutality.
It's not just whether you're alive or dead.
That's right.
Right, other forms are much more difficult.
That's right. And I mean, that has to be addressed also.
Right, it does.
And I think you have to address that by reducing police power. You have to also give ordinary people much more power to be able to take action against the police.
And elect mayors and DAs that are really good on policing issues.
Okay, yeah. But, you know, also changing legislation, like I said, that's extremely important also, right?
Yep.
I think we have a question over here.
So something that's extremely baffling to me, especially in the time of social media, are police apologists that refuse to see that there's something inherently and institutionally wrong with the way police deal with marginalized and people of color in the communities. So where did this narrative of hero worship, which is kind of what it is, where they hold police officers to this standard of that they're God and they can't be wrong, and if they kill someone, it had to have been that person's fault. Like, where does that narrative stem from? Not only with unions, but I'm talking about regular, everyday citizens and civilians.
Right.
You want to take it?
I'll say one thing. You don't understand. That's the explanation. You don't know, you don't do the job, so you don't understand the job. So you can't, that's what they said in '66 when they were trying to put the Civilian Review Board through. Even though it was virtually powerless. It could make recommendations to the commissioner. We think this is what you should do, but you're under no obligation to do anything. The police said, these people, unless they're employed by the police department, they don't understand, and they are in no position to be assessing us.
It's also, I'm sorry.
Okay.
What's also true is that white communities and black communities, or black and Puerto Rican or communities of color, have a very different experience with police. White police, in white neighborhoods, police protect the community. In most middle-class white neighborhoods, people are relieved to see the police. They trust the police, they have a good relationship with the police behave in a particular way in the neighborhood, so they believe in the police, and they are the voters. They vote for mayors that promise law and order and to protect them from dangerous communities. They vote for these law and order DAs, and they believe in the police. And people in poor communities of color, police are an occupying force. So that's why we see on every survey, what people of color think about police is very diametrically opposite from what white people say about police, because their experiences with police are different.
Yeah, I do want to, narratives are complicated. And, I mean, I shouldn't say the narratives are complicated. Everyone has their own narratives that they construct. In 1964, you're absolutely right. Many white New Yorkers constructed a narrative where Lieutenant Gilligan was a hero cop who had 20 years on the force, all sorts of citations for rescuing black and white individuals. One of the ironies of Lieutenant Gilligan's career is that after 1964, he did in fact briefly return to the force, and he saved the life of a black man who had collapsed in the street and was having a seizure. Now, at the same time, in 1964, people looked at Gilligan, and all across the city there were pamphlets that said "Killer Cop." You know, two completely different narratives and perspectives. And I don't know if either narrative is 100% accurate one way. It's really, really hard to know. There were narratives surrounding James Powell, the victim, in 1964. Some people were arguing that this was a kid who had been getting in trouble a lot and had been getting in trouble in school, and that's why he was going to summer school. Not that that should in any way justify what happens to him. Other people presented him as, you know, a completely sort of, people construct narratives out of their own different life experiences, you were saying, and that really does sort of complicate our efforts to make sense of this world and create the kind of political action that you've been talking about.
Yeah, but geography is important too, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because part of the narrative of this situation is these kids didn't belong in that white neighborhood, right? So let's go back to the Chicago police. Basically, they recruit from gangs who do keep the racial boundary, So you be a cop and you keep the racial boundary. So that may have something to do with why the same officer in one space, which is supposed to be a white space, would kill somebody, but in a Negro space, act like a little different, right? As a black person who was beaten by the police when I was 12 years old, when I asked the police to come and help me because the gang had beat me up, right? That's one case. This same body, I'm at University of Penn, I call a cop, and I'm at the university space. I don't believe it. This white cop is so polite. It's so different precincts have different sets of rules.
Right.
So we have to put geography in it, and then there's rules of the game in certain territories. So what we're saying for blacks and Latinos and other oppressed people is that we have to force new rules in the territory we live in.
Right.
And that goes back to some of the Black Panthers and the Young Lords and things that people were demanding. And we're all trying to do this anti-Trump thing. We cannot forget police brutality and killer cops on our agenda for this unity, right? We usually deep six our demands for the sake of unity. But this is life and death, right? So when we do the unity this time, let's make sure our lives do matter in that deal, and let's not forget this is a political question. It's not just job training and all that stuff like that, right?
Right, and I also want to say that there are individual narratives, but there are also those with power that push narratives, and they a lot more forceful. They reach a lot more people. Let's talk about law enforcement itself. You want to talk about the origins of this? Law enforcement itself has been pushing this narrative about glorifying police officers. The media has been pushing this for decades. I go back and I like to listen to old-time radio. I mean, how many cop shows were there on the old-time radio back in the 1930s? This is your FBI, and Dragnet, and so on. So cops have always been glorified. There's a long history of this, and at the same time, black and brown folks have been demonized. Essentially, they're there to guard against keeping black and Latino folks in their place. And so, I argue that this is extremely hard to, for people in the freedom struggle fighting against police brutality, to win people over. Why? Look at Trump and what and this guy Jeff Sessions, and essentially they're pushing this notion about essentially supporting our police at this point, and how that resonates with so many Americans.
Right, but it's a long political strategy that politicians have gotten elected by, creating this image of a very dangerous minority community that they are going to protect from. And, it's, as you know, Goldwater did it, Nixon did it, his Southern strategy, certainly Giuliani did it.
Take over.
Oh, wait, we have some more questions out there?
Can I?
We better.
Yeah, let's get.
Can you fold it into the next one? Because we want to make sure that people get there. How many more people do we have questions? Just one? Okay, all right.
Hi, so I have a comment and a question. My name is Sacred Walker. I'm a holistic psychologist. So something that I notice is, in my opinion, in studying the trauma of slavery and the soul of this country, is in supporting people who experience emotional pain, is that there's so much of this that I see in parallel to domestic violence, the way that this country holds its relationship to the police. And as someone who grew up in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, at the height of the Crown Heights riots, of seeing the effect of how police brutality affects a community. And so something that I think is complicated, because I know you were bringing up the fact that there are decreased murder rates, is that similar to domestic violence leading up to, there are many different ways, kind of the way that you mentioned how your son daily was being attacked, or you walking down the street being attacked. That's a similar to domestic violence, where there are many different approaches that someone can have to break down your spirit until the murder happens, right? And those points are ignored until you feel like you have to respond because you've experience something very confrontational. And so that's my concern, that's my fear, is when we point out and we only look at violence and police brutality from a murder perspective, we miss all the microaggressions that have led to that point before the breaking happens where the riots are experienced. And so someone in the audience mentioned that the most people who are impacted by police brutality are people who are mentally ill, right? But if you have people moving in this double consciousness of, I'm constantly afraid that the people I'm supposed to call if I'm afraid, or if I'm experiencing domestic violence, I'm supposed to pick up the phone, 911 is supposed to be a responder. But what happens if the person who's responding becomes my perpetrator? Who in this society is supposed to keep us safe, right? That ends up being the question. So I'm wondering then, to the panel, what kind of mental health support are we seeing for both the police? Because the minute I've done work with and I've met with Eric Garner's mother, et cetera, the minute that a police officer says they need mental health support, there's the first quick thing to say is, oh, you're not equipped for the job. So that's the reality, okay? And what mental health support is being done for those who, after an injustice happens, they have to move on? $1 million is not gonna heal a broken heart, right? When you lose your child. Exactly. So what kind of mental health support is being done across the board in a way that's really gonna sustain so the explosion doesn't happen and a murder takes place? Thank you.
Does anybody want to take that on? that may not be the expertise on this panel, unfortunately.
I will just say, I mean, Percy Sutton didn't use the word microaggression, but I think he was getting to your point when I was speaking to him and he was talking about his experiences. And I did see the pain and the impact it had on him. And you consider how successful and accomplished he was, and you could still see the resonance in his face.
Yeah, I should say, just, and this is not going to be good therapy, but when I got beat up by the police at 12, the first thing I did was realize, okay, the adults are not going to support me. I need to join a gang. Right? And thank goodness the gang leader wouldn't let me join. He told me my studies were important, so that was, but that's, you know, sorry, that was just lucky, right? But I think most kids, that's what's going on, is you begin to see the police as another gang. Right. That's the way you're experiencing it. They bully you on the corner, right? And so how do you deal with that, right? If your parents don't seem to understand, right? So we do need some, you know, counseling and things like that, but we also need some real alternatives for these kids. And that's what the Young Lords and the Black Panthers and all these other groups were an alternative, because there is a kind of a ritual of humiliation that the police are doing to you. And you have to have some ritual of healing to solve that, right? And some feeling that you have power, sort of marching. A lot of this physical marching and stuff like that people seem to be afraid of is actually kids working it out nonviolently.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, and in fact, in 1964, the strategy of James Farmer and Bayard Rustin to some extent was to organize and mobilize angry young people and get them to march and demonstrate as a way of dealing with the feelings that you've just described so well.
Yeah, because your interviews really, I mean, these kids are doing self-destructive things to themselves by internalizing, right? That narrative of I'm cutting myself, and they could imagine all the other things, killing themselves, killing each other, right?
But
so what people call radical politics, I could call it that too, is a positive response to, rather than internalize it and do self-destruction to try to change society, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that activism is a form of therapy. I think that parents who were active and believed that they accomplished something, my sense of Gwen Carr was that she felt that they had done something that would help other kids, and that was healing in certain ways. I think that that does, you know, that's mostly where communities found solace, was in working to change things for others.
Those on the ground organizing also, they discuss offering support to victims of police brutality. You mentioned Richie Perez.
Right, exactly.
National Congress, Puerto Rican Rights.
Well, he created the Justice Committee that
The
did
Justice
all of
Committee,
these
that's right.
cases, including Eric Garner's case, including going to Albany. That was Richie Perez's.
That's right, and but he also made it clear that we have to give support to the families of folks.
Right. Because that's my argument why they don't have riots in New York, is because as soon as somebody is killed, they get calls from the Justice Committee, from Communities United, from the Parents Against Police Brutality. Everybody calls. They offer them solace, they offer them community, they make them feel they're not alone, they offer them a path to justice, they have a strategy, they offer them, who are sympathetic councilmen, who they could work, how they're going to pursue justice. All of that makes a difference. I interviewed people in Ferguson, and everybody's talked about being absolutely on their own.
Right. Oh, we got two questions here. Okay.
Hello. My question is basically targeted towards culture and technology and the impact that technology has played in the police brutality, resistance movement. For one thing, I guess technology has brought about smartphones, and so police are held more accountable, and social media awareness in terms of Black Lives Matter movements where people can mobilize through social media platforms. So you said earlier that one of the key objectives is to sort of take power away from the police and sort of empower the citizens. And there's a recent research by Associated Press last week said that Black youth access internet by smartphones more than any other demographic. They use social media for awareness more than any other demographic, and they do cultural content 66% more off of their smartphones and devices. So it's sort of something that's embedded in their culture. So my question is, based off of your reflection, off of your research, how has technology sort of impacted this movement, and how can it be used as a sort of solution or a way to empower the Black youth?
This goes back to this discussion of narratives that we had, because up until a few years ago, you had the police account, and you had the victim or victim's family's account or whomever. The police side was privileged, it had more power, it got more coverage, it was disseminated by the local government or whatever. And these things generally stayed local matters. The Rodney King beating was videotaped, but it was per chance, it made it onto the news. And I'm thinking back, this is kind of random, but to my calculus classes in college, and there's, if you think about limits, like something will decrease, but it never quite hits the axis. And I think that's what social media is doing for narratives. It flattens narratives, because the officer can say in his report, oh, the car was backing up at me aggressively, and so I had to shoot to protect my life. And then his own, in this case, his own camera footage contradicts that and says, well, it shows, no, actually the car was pulling away and then you started shooting. And there are any number of things like this that the police account initially will say, well, this is what happened. And then someone puts a video on Instagram or YouTube or whatever, and oh, well, that's not actually what happened. And so it does give normal, ordinary people more power and more voice to challenge the dominant narrative, and it makes it a lot harder. It's like some people are always going to say, well, there's something there that you don't understand. There's something going on you didn't see, and he wouldn't have done that. He's not just going to shoot somebody. But I think a lot of people see this and say, maybe now they'll move, well, that was just a bad cop. But at least they're acknowledging, this is me trying to be hopeful, at least they're acknowledging there are bad cops. There are people who just shoot people.
The other question.
Really excellent. Hi. Really excellent panel. I was thinking about all four of you spoke about 1964, and I'm thinking previous to 1964 is the developments of Robert Moses and the expressways in New York and white flight. But I'm curious about the transformation of the police force because someone mentioned that there was like 27,000 police officers and only 200 Puerto Rican officers, or like, you know, several thousand black officers. So at what point was there a racial, like, did the racial divide increase for maybe white officers living in the suburbs and then those living in the city? Because I feel like Black Lives Matter protests now, everyone who's screaming in my face has an accent from like Staten Island. So I'm curious if that's like a historical thing or is this just a current topic?
Well, there had been a law in the city that was called the Lyons Law. And it said that for most municipal employees, to even apply, you had to live in the city. You had to have residence here before you could even try to get a job. And there were people who said, well,
Did
this
you
is...
say the Liars Law?
What's that? Lions.
Oh, Lions. I'm sorry.
Lyons.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's probably someone's name. They said, well, this is inhibiting our ability to attract talent because we can only interview people who already live here. And so the mayor signed off on this in '62, I think. And so it meant that the police force that was already basically 95% white didn't have to live here anymore. They could, still now they can live in, I think, one of 6 counties. And so they all move out to the white suburbs like Long Island or whatever. And so it increasingly, I mean, you already had like a lot of tension between these white officers and the people of color they were policing. And New York's population of color grows enormously in the middle of the 20th century. And it moves, that was bad enough, but then it becomes people who are truly exterior to this, like they come into the city and then they leave. They may have grown up here, but it's not the place where they grew up. And so, and they're moving away from community policing. It's guys in squad cars driving around, jumping out to snatch someone, and then driving back to the station. And so that's when people articulate the idea of the police as an occupying force, it gains a lot more weight because these really are outsiders, people who are alienated from the populations that they're serving.
I just want to make 2 quick comments. First, I mean, blacks have historically, traditionally been underrepresented in the New York Police Department, and that's been going on for decades and decades and decades. One interesting point, I interviewed quite a few black officers for my book. And one of the stories they told, and the research sort of confirmed it, is that not only were they underrepresented, but in the late 1950s, the decision was made in part in response to protests from civil rights organizations. They were spread across the city. You know, they were no longer concentrated in Harlem or in Bed-Stuy and places like that, which meant that they had sort of even less influence, and it made it more difficult later on for them to sort of do their job or to try to restore peace to their neighborhoods and their streets. And I now want to make a comment that I don't know how well this will go over, but based on the conversations that I had with a lot of officers, I do think we need to be a little careful about demonizing all police officers, because many of the officers I talked to sort of shared their frustration about what the department leadership and what other officers were doing in terms of discrediting them, discrediting what they were trying to do, making their work harder. And so, I mean, I think those sort of political solutions are really necessary because I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that there are plenty of officers in that 27,000, black and white, who are trying to do their job and are trying to serve the community, and their work is made very, very hard. So that's my comment, and like I said, I don't know how people will take it, but.
They speak up. Exactly. Young people speak up.
Right.
Now, I think that we want to do this at the mic, if we can.
All right, yeah. So I was just going to say, I mean, in the 1990s, only 5% of the police officers in New York were not white, and I think that changed dramatically after 2000. I think that the graduating class from the academy was majority minority a couple of years ago. I think that's being transformed. But what minority police officers always told me was that they experienced a great deal of racism inside the department. And he says, you know, they say the police is like your family, but, you know, they don't treat you like your family. He says it's, you know, you never hear about black officers killing white, uniformed, undercover police officers. It's always white police officers killing black police officers. And one police officer told me that when he would come into the department, he'd say, I saw you guys in the street yesterday. You walked right past me. And they'd say, oh, we didn't see you, because if you're not in your uniform, they're suddenly invisible. And it was black officers who told me, you know, he says, listen, the only thing we've been asking is that police the same in black neighborhoods as they do in white neighborhoods. But he says the kinds of orders we get and the kinds of rewards we get and what the chief expects us to do is different in black neighborhoods than in white neighborhoods.
That's right. Kamosi, we actually have 2 more questions. Can we just take the last 2 together?
Okay.
So if you guys want to prepare your questions together. Yep.
Okay, Kamosi, how you doing, everybody?
All right.
There was 2 questions asked, and the young lady was talking about the culture of the police. When I joined an organization known as the Black Panther Party, the reason why I joined was because of the police doing the things in our community. They were terrorizing my people, and I felt that I had to stand up as an individual with myself and the rest of my comrades to stop that terrorization. We were being terrorized in our communities. Our children were being shot down like they're doing today. And then another thing I noticed, why during the weekend there's more policemen that is Caucasians in the black community and the Latin community than there is black policemen? Can you all answer that question for me? I have noticed this for the last few years.
And our second question is?
I'm similar theme to a gentleman behind me saying. Similar to what the dude said about Staten Island. I think that a lot of times we make the mistake of transferring power from police officers from Staten Island to politicians from Staten Island, and that for like actual healing to occur in the communities that are like black and Spanish and minority, the people within those communities have to feel the power of the change themselves, like the sir behind me felt in the Black Panthers Party. If the healing, true healing occurs when people are able to see injustice and act against it. Not when people see injustice and wait for someone to do something about it. We are the people who must do something about it. Like the true heroes are gonna come from the sufferers, and that's where the healing occurs, through turning suffering into heroism, not through waiting for some type of miracle to occur through a political party or through the police party. Because we can't, it's gonna occur through relation. So my question is, how can there be, of course it's gonna be a political movement, but how can there be an informal politics? And when I say informal, I mean not me asking someone, but rather me communing with fellow sufferers of what's happening and doing something about it.
All right, I'll give this to our illustrious panel here. There's 2 questions.
All right, so for the organizations that I worked with that were part of Communities United for Police Reform, a lot of those organizations came out of the Black Panther Party or the Young Lords. So those efforts to fight police brutality got filtered down into organizations that became dedicated to that fight, and I think have won some measure of success on certain levels. I think that what we have to do is elect people that actually have a progressive agenda on policing issues. Right now, those folks who organize around being tough on crime, look at Trump. We currently have more people incarcerated than any country in the history of the world. And we have a candidate who ran on being more tough on crime, more prisons, more incarceration, more police, at a time we also have the lowest crime rates. So we have to organize a different around a different narrative and a different agenda and get different people elected that have authority over the police.
You know, just one little fact you asked about the demography, change of demography. We walk around with a minority mentality, and the media suggests that to us, but the wake-up call is we're actually the majority in the city, right? And we need to start moving like the majority and stop acting like the minority, right? As long as they can convince you you're a minority, then you're begging them for your rights, right? So you look at television, you look like a minority, and on and on and on. So as long as you have that kind of Novocaine going on there, you'll be asleep on the fact that, wake up, we're the majority here. We should be treated like that, and that's not reflected on the police force.
Right. You know, and I think it is important that we do elect people who are going to push an agenda of police reform. But we also got to hold these people accountable. It's, you know, they can run like de Blasio did and, you know, make, you know, eloquent argument of what he's going to do, but then, you know, he's going to back off. I mean, you know, I think we got to, you know, present and push that agenda of reducing police power. I'm talking about, you know, people getting arrested for these ridiculous misdemeanors. Now, de Blasio will not back off of broken windows. Will not back off of broken windows. And he's been asked this on several occasions, especially now they say, well, you know, we're looking at this assault on undocumented workers. And many of them in the system I'm working in, CUNY, you know, have records because of broken windows. And so they can be rounded up, you know, accused of crime. He will not back off. So I think it's going to be more than just electing people. You know, I think we're going to have to, you know, grassroots organizing is going to, you know, they're going to have to put pressure on these folks, you know, to really come through.
Any other final comments we're about to, just before we sign our books? I think I just got the cutoff point there. Okay, so I want to give our panel a hand for doing a wonderful presentation. And please, don't go with that Abby Hoffman thing about steal this book. Pay for the book, and they'll sign it for you out in the lobby there. All right.